westthegospel.com. Welcome to westthegospel.com. Um, I'm going to riff a little bit more on the theme of mainline liberalism and easy believism, um, and mainly on the causes of that. Um, and that would be number one. I believe, based on stuff I've read and just observation, the main reason why both of these things exist as dominating ideologies in American culture is narcissism. I mean, they both have the same root cause, I think, and that is narcissism. Um, Narcissism could be defined as staring at yourself in the mirror all the time. For example, making a bunch of YouTube videos about no, it goes deeper than that. Um, Narcissism is essentially preoccupation with gratifying your own selfish pleasures. Another way to call it is to call it hedonism, which is just the blind pursuit of pleasure at the expense of everything else. Epicureanism is really the philosophical basis for all of this, believe it or not. There's actually a philosophy um, from ancient Greece that gave intellectual arguments uh, in for hedonism and narcissism, and it was called Epicureanism. And you might think, wow, geez, some people have really been dedicated to this. Yeah, um, and this philosopher was named Epicurus, Epicurus, and his belief was that first off, that he was an atheist. So that was step number one. And in order to become an Epicurean, you had to be an atheist. So he rejected the gods of Greece and rejected all gods. He was an atheist. And so he tried to get a group of people together, a bunch of atheist group, an atheist club. And after doing so, he argued that, well, now that there's no God or gods telling us what to do with our lives, I guess we're on our own, and it's up to us to ascribe meaning, come up with meaning for our lives. And so he would sit there, and and they would have these intellectual conversations about what was necessary for an Epicurean atheist to do in order to ascribe any degree of meaning out of their lives. Generally, he agreed with Aristotle. He agreed with Plato. When the assumption generally was among the Greek philosophers that the pursuit of happiness is the ultimate meaning of life. That was where we get life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in American terminology. They were borrowing from Greek philosophers when they did that. So that's essentially what these Greek philosophers, most of them believed in, except for the Stoics. Most of them believed that the pursuit of happiness was the ultimate aim and purpose of life. And where this conflicts or differentiates from Jesus is that Jesus said, um, I have come that you might have life and life more abundantly. Um, and then we have references to the joy of the Lord and joy being the fruit of the Spirit. So Jesus isn't against happiness, but he would be against the way Epicurus defined happiness. Jesus' form of happiness is derived from experience of the Holy Spirit. Epicurus most definitely did not have the Holy Spirit. And so Epicurus' definition of happiness essentially boiled down to fornication and drunkenness. Um, Basically, the type of quote unquote happiness that you're going to get in a frat at a state university. Okay, um, that's basically what they have because they don't have the Holy Spirit. to provide them with joy, which is super abundant happiness, they have to resort to the world's definitions, the world's expressions of happiness, which is basically sex and alcohol. I mean, that's basically what it boils down to. And now drugs, sex, drugs, and alcohol, same thing. Um, so, that is really shallow. Um, Number one, uh, sex is only useful within the within the confines of Christian marriage, um, and um, and procreation is one of the biological side effects of sex, which means that if you start referring to sex as your main form of happiness in Earth, you could end up having children as the side of that, and children are not always a source of happiness. Um, they're going to start crying and whining, and you're going to have to start disciplining them. So uh, God set it up for a reason to be a thing that was meant to be for family, not for reckless pleasure seeking. But ever since Epicurus, people have been using sex for reckless pleasure seeking, and now today, you can see this all over the internet and on all over just the way people talk. A lot of today's modern dating concepts are based off of sex alone. Um, so you know, it's a hedonistic culture. Generational studies have shown that World War II and the Great Depression had caused a massive amount of discipline and self-discipline to be among the Great Generation, our grandparents' generation, essentially, um, people who were in their youth during the 30s and the 40s. And that this generation was far from righteous as a whole, but um, they had these massive negative experiences, the Great Depression and World War II. These massive negative experiences caused them to look to conservative forms of joy as a source of happiness, like having settling down and having a family and going to church and having morals and stuff like this, because they had been brought to the brink of poverty. They had been brought to the brink of life and death, and so they had thought through all this stuff on a really large scale pretty early on, um, uh, to think about the meaning of life. There is no atheists in foxholes. Um, but after they baby boomed all their children, um, the baby boomers came to be called the me generation. For one reason or another, they just characteristically got associated with narcissism. And I've looked into why that is. I've watched a couple of documentaries about it. It seems that one of the main reasons why the baby boomer generation, this is people born in the 1950s and 60s, are associated with narcissism is because their child rearing philosophy was based off of a book called uh, Something, Something or Another Child Rearing by Dr. Spock. And apparently, this book taught parents not to spank their children. Um, and it was actually anti-corporal punishment, and it taught them to not teach them moral lessons, essentially, but to just pamper them, just pamper them and let them play and stuff like this. And I think it was just a very permissive parenting philosophy. And this was an extremely popular book. And for people who didn't read the book, the idea was out there so much that you could say that most of the parents in the 1950s were raising their children according to sort of a spoil their child and spare the rod sort of ideology, which kind of goes back to Pilgrim's Progress, where the character Obstinate was became obstinate because his parents spoiled the child and spared the rod. And and so we created through that permissive parenting philosophy in the 50s a very narcissistic, obstinate generation of baby boomers. Um, and I can't blame that on rock and roll. I can't blame that on drugs. I see that, um, I like rock and roll music. Um, and I don't consider myself narcissistic, just because I like rock and roll music. I think the issue is that narcissism says that you have to make your whole life about pleasure or you're just going to be miserable. So the ultimate goal is to move to Florida and travel to Europe, and that's the ultimate meaning in life. Um, and God has nothing to do with that because He's just going to take all your fun away. Um, so, there are people that I've spoken to that have said things like, I don't want to be a Christian because that would mean I wouldn't be able to have fun anymore. Um, to the fact that there's people out there that are thinking like that today is disturbing. Um, Number one, you don't have to not have fun anymore if you're a Christian. It just means that certain kinds of fun you're not going to have, like fornication and drunkenness. Um, and you're going to put rules on what fun is to be. Um, but you know, the fact that there's people out there that are completely driven by narcissism, completely driven by it, um, and that when they look at Christianity, they just have to look the other way, is really sad. You know, those people, when I'm seeing, I pity those people. I'm sad for them because they're going to get older and older and older as the decades go on. They're not going to read any Christian theology books. They're not going to read the Bible. They're not going to increase their faith. They're not going to go through stages of spiritual development or anything like that. They're not going to get closer to the Spirit of God. They're not going to ever have any memorable experiences of the Spirit of God because they keep distancing themselves from that. Um, and they're doing that by their own choice. So I believe mainline liberalism and antinomianism have come from deism and antinomianism, mainline liberalism and easy believism have come from narcissism. These are people that understand the value of narcissism and they want to keep it near and dear to their heart. Okay, they love narcissism. They love themselves far, far more than they love their neighbor. But sometimes they have this thought, what if God exists? What if God is real? What if hell is real? Sometimes they think this, sometimes. And so they try to fill that part of that little tiny slot of their heart with church. And so they go to these shallow liberal churches, these mainline liberal churches that have things like evolution. They allow for everything. They're broad. They allow for everything. Evolution, homosexuality, abortion, uh, some fourth thing that I was gonna, oh yeah, Bible contradiction type thinking. Just every single heretical concept out there. They just, hey, come on in, everybody's welcome. Why? Because we're not really seriously considering Christianity here. We're just kind of like giving it some cursory thought and we'll go back to our lives, go back to our boats and have some fun. And that's 75% of American population right there. When you look at the South, you have the remaining 20% of the American population in the South, and that's the easy believism, Baptists that are tied up with, independent fundamental Baptist movement and um, Southern Baptists and people connected with Dallas Theological Seminary. It's the idea that Jesus died for my sins, and that's great. I love Jesus. I just love Jesus. But I'm not gonna keep the commandments or anything. I'm not gonna like do all those red letters that Jesus said that, or I mean, or maybe, those were, he was just talking about those things to the people in his times. And he's not talking about those things to our times, and so I don't have to obey them. But that was just for people way back then, to obey them. And so you end up with this cafeteria Christianity with these people, explaining away, because they still want to have narcissism being the driving force in their lives. So I believe that poor parenting, reckless parenting, spoil the rod, spare the child, creates an obstinate generation that's preoccupied with self, has no sense of loving neighbor, serving neighbor, no sense of duty to others, and no fear of God, no fear of hell, no spirituality, no theology. And it's just as shallow as can be, and it's all driven by boats in Florida, in Europe. It's all driven by capital accumulation. It's all driven by pleasure-seeking, fornication, drunkenness. It's all driven by vice. And that is why we have liberalism, and that is why we have antinomianism. And you might say, well, why is narcissism the cause of liberalism and antinomianism? Because it is a self-seeking motivation. It is not a God-seeking motivation. The motive, the ulterior motive, the ultimate motive is to serve self, is to gratify flesh, is to not deny self, which is one of the core principles of Christian spirituality, self-denial. And you might say, well, why is it that mainline liberalism is the more popular one? Because of science, because of scientism, and because of the Age of Enlightenment. It's just become more popular to think of things in terms of science, to think of things scientifically, even spiritual things. And when that comes to Christianity, it also comes to witchcraft, New Age, psychic subjects, anything that's on X-Files, basically, is going to be looked at from a skeptical Agent Scully point of view. It's going to look at, now there are those that don't buy that, and there are those that are open to ghosts and paranormal phenomena, and those people usually live in the South. And so those people, although still driven massively by narcissism, just can't bring themselves to believe that there's a naturalistic scientific explanation for everything. So they end up settling down on easy believism and Christianity. That while they're still driven by narcissism, they just can't bring themselves into a completely rationalistic scientific mind frame like the people in the North. And so they settle for a form of Christianity that is still antinomian, so they can still just be just as narcissistic as the people in the North, while having just a sliver of supernaturalism in their thinking. Well, that's where I'm at right now, into the motives, the narcissistic motives for why mainline liberalism and easy believism exist. That's why I think they exist. It'd be nice to see academic books corroborate that for me. I am planning eventually on writing a booklet on these two things eventually, because as I was going through biblical economics, these things kept coming up. They kept coming up as one of the primary reasons why economics is associated with worldliness. So anyway, God bless you out there. This is John with wesleygospel.com.